officielle. Les difficultés du mouvement chrétien au deuxième et troisième siècle.
On n'a pas beaucoup de temps d'après le programme.
L'étude que je consacre, de la Res Publica Romana.
Exploité au
première vue, rien à voir avec ce.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my paper I shall attempt to describe the development of paradigmatic settlement sites on the island of Crete between 1200 and 700 BC, to describe changes and discontinuities as well as continuities, and to ask at which stage we are allowed to define a settlement as a polis, an urban structure. The rise of the polis in Greek antiquity has been a central theme of classical archaeology as well as ancient history since the opus maximum La Cité Antique by Fustel de Coulanges, a well-known historian at Strasbourg, published in 1864. Problems of the definition of a Greek polis, of the political structures, of the architectural components, of the chronology, of the complex and complicated processes of urbanization have been discussed in recent years by François de Polignac in his book La naissance de la cité grecque of 1995, by Domenico Musti, Pierre Callier and Anthony Snodgrass, just to mention some names. Snodgrass has emphasized that the evolution of large urban sanctuaries as a focal point of group identification is one of the decisive criteria, and Polignac has described the relations between polis and chora, city and the surrounding landscape, as well as the role of peri and extra-urban sanctuaries which helped to mark the boundaries of a territory. Among the authors who have devoted studies to the island of Crete, we may mention Henri van Effonterre, Nicholas Coldstream, and during the last years Daniela Lefebvre-Navarro. The basic ancient source for the definition and the theories of the evolution of the polis system is, as well known, the first book of Aristotle's Politeia, a late text but based on older sources. A polis, in his definition, is an autonomous state consisting of a central settlement and the surrounding countryside, polis and chora. Aristotle, and I quote Nicholas Coldstream, implies that the Greek had in early times lived in villages, in chormai. In the fullness of time, the polis arose from a partnership of villages uniting for their own common good and thereby achieving complete self-sufficiency. On the Greek mainland, this Aristotelian theory seems to be confirmed by archaeological evidence, for example in Athens or in Eretria on the island of Euboea. But in Crete, as we will see, conditions are completely different. If we try to gain a definition of an early polis, there are two literary sources: the characterization of a polis in war and a polis in peace in the description of the shield of Achilles in the 18th song of the Iliad, and the description of the city of the Phaeacians in the 6th and 7th songs of the Odyssey. A prerequisite for urban life, according to Homer, is the nourishment of population based on agriculture, which makes concentration of population and demographic increase possible. Characteristics of urban economy are specialized craftsmanship, trade as well, and the most important factor is the organization of social life, among others, rites of initiation. A dominant role in political life is attributed to a council of gerontes, older members of the aristocracy, which may elect a king. Homeric epics give further definitions. Polis and chora form a university. Unity. The polis is characterized by complexity of residential buildings, a system of streets, a public space, the agora, place of the assemblages of the community, which may be connected with urban sanctuaries functioning as religious centers of self-identification. Buildings for political administration and the administration of justice, which means law courts, and in monarchy, the palace of the king are further components. Homer's polis is fortified by a city wall. A city at the coast has harbor installations. The oldest epigraphic evidence which mentions the term polis is a law from Dreros on the island of Crete, a decision of the demos which deals with the institution of the kosmoi, officials responsible for the administration of the city. Furthermore, the inscription mentions damioi, whose function cannot be defined with certainty, and a council of the Ikati Taspolios, which means the 20 of the city. Thus, the time is around 650. During the 7th century, we are confronted with a complex political structure. Many of these criteria are, of course, not visible in the archaeological record as social institutions, political structures, demographic data. Worse, as far as archaeology is concerned, we have no completely excavated settlement. The archaeological evidence is sporadic and fragmentary. Furthermore, a good number of the excavations which I will present have not yet been published in detail, so we have to keep this in mind. The places which I shall examine in the following are, starting in the 12th century, Karfi, Halasmenos on the Isthmus of Ierapetra, Kavusi a bit further to the east, and Sybrita here in the west in the Amari Valley. Places which have a long and continuous tradition of settlements are, of course, Knossos and Festos in the south, Kidonia in the west, modern Hania as well. And for the 8th and 7th centuries BC, we will regard Dreros, Gortys, and Prinias here halfway between Heraklion and Festos. Around 1200 BC, a period of unrest in the Aegean, of destructions and migrations within the general framework of a crisis in the eastern Mediterranean, we may observe the break-off of traditional settlements on Crete, for example, Mallia, as well as continuity at the same time, although at a reduced scale, for example, at Knossos and Festos. A new phenomenon of this period, around 1200, are refuge settlements, settlements on hills, even high mountains, positions which give natural defense, usually some kilometers away from the coast, clear evidence of a period of danger and a period of the retreat of groups of the population from the coast to more easily defendable inland sites in the mountainous areas of Crete. An extreme example is provided by the large settlement of Karfi, which is situated here approximately at the northern periphery of the Lasiti Mountains, at a height of 1100 meters above sea level, isolated by snow and ice in winter. It's a new foundation showing systematic planning of alleys and small squares within a complex arrangement of houses with multiple rooms, a type that has been called Konglomeratsiedlung, conglomerate settlement, by Wolf-Dieter Heilmeier. In the east part, there are more regular houses, some of them of megaron type, possible residences of leading members of this community. The largest extent of the settlement is approximately 160 meters west to east. A central sanctuary has been located at the northern periphery at this place. Among the finds are terracotta goddesses with raised arms, typical of late Minoan 3C, the 12th century BC. Whether there was a fortification wall is not known. The pottery is confined to an advanced period of late Minoan 3C, although some later material, although still late Minoan 3C, has been identified by Saru Wallace during recent excavations. Storage jars to the left, pithoi, were found in large quantities. In winter, when the site was isolated, storage of grain and oil was vital. Water was available about 100 meters further down, where a spring was located during John Pendlebury's excavations of the site at the end of the 1930s. The great height, extreme climatic conditions in winter, long ways to arable land led to the abandonment of this large settlement already during the 12th century, and its foundation must have been due to a period of extreme crisis in this region. The settlement of Halasmenos on a low hill about 200 meters above sea level here, at the east border of the Isthmus of Ierapetra, near the northern coast, in a strategical position overlooking the wide and fertile plain of the Isthmus, beside the entrance to the gorge of Ha, this one here, very impressive site. Halasmenos displays a different situation. During the 12th century BC, there was a systematic planning of long, rectangular, megaron-like houses parallel with one another, and the stone architecture is of rather high quality. There are open squares, a sanctuary has been identified. Again, there are no secure traces of a fortification wall, although it must have existed because the hill is low and easily accessible. Halasmenos shows a continuous settlement until the geometric period down to the 8th century, probably due to its strategic position. At the extremely steep north slope of the entrance here into the village, into the gorge of Kha, small buildings have been erected on small terraces, like here for example, but these were inhabited only during a short period, possibly before the establishment of the larger settlement. Halasmenos was not the only settlement on the Isthmus of Ierapetra. There's another one on the western border, approximately here, which is called Kefala Vasilikis, of the same period and visible from Halasmenos. At Kefala, only a temple embracing several rooms, some of them with benches and hearths, have been systematically explored by the Greek Archaeological Service. It is a forerunner of the later typical Cretan hearth temples of the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Like these, it is a cultic center for the assemblage of groups of the population who met there for common meals, banquets, combined with offerings to the gods. The slide illustrates some of the pottery from Halasmenos. Kefala up to now has not been published. The main phase in Halasmenos is late Manon 3C, fine wares and cooking pots, but the settlement, which was never more than a small village, continued, as you can see, into the late 8th century BC. Quite a different type of a contemporary settlement is offered by the settlement of Ronda at Kavusi. On a low hill about 300 meters above sea level, inhabited only during late Manon 3C. It is a settlement of scattered, multi-roomed houses of irregular plan, a type of settlement called Einzelhaussiedlung by Hallmeier, a settlement of single houses. There is a communal shrine at this place. A large rectangular cellar with an anteroom, a room with benches and a hearth, again an early manifestation of a hearth temple. A cemetery of small tholos tombs is positioned directly to the north. In Kafi, the tombs are at a lower level of the hill, approximately 30 minutes of walking away. The slide gives one of the houses with central hearth, and below one of these small typical tholos of the period, as well as a selection of typical pottery types of an advanced late Minoan 3C date. As I said, Vronda was not inhabited in later periods. Altogether, 3 settlement sites have been identified at Kavousi. This here is Vronda, the other one Azoria, and there was a settlement on top, on the settle of this hill at about 700 meters in height. This is Kavousi Castro. It's about 2 hours to walk from Vronda up to Castro, but nevertheless the place was inhabited from late Minoan 3C into the early Orientalizing period after 700 BC, was probably the residence of a small aristocratic group in a well-defendable position, and they all had a separate small sanctuary on top of the hill. On the right I show one two-room building of the 8th century date, very well built, with even architecture of columns in the main room. A successor of Castro was the settlement on the low conical hill of Azoria, dating to the 7th to 5th centuries. Residential areas are arranged on terraces around the hill, as well as typical communal buildings of the archaic Cretan society of this time. Foremost, a communal dining room with benches, with a hearth and an altar here. That's the photograph of this situation. Nevertheless, Azoria did not develop into a polis. The place was abandoned during the 5th century BC, possibly due to the rise of more successful and more powerful neighbors like Dreros and Irapetna. Better evidence for the transformation of a small Bronze Age settlement into a classical polis may be illustrated by the structures unearthed on the Acropolis of Sybrita, a hill which dominates the central part of the fertile Amari Valley, the Amari Valley which divides the White Mountains in the west from Mount Ida in the center of the island. The place has been investigated by an Italian-Greek mission during the last years. Settlement starts with scattered houses of late Minoan 3C date, one of these structures here. And during a long following period, from the end of late Minoan 3C to Proto-Geometric B, which means from the 12th to the 9th century BC, the area changed its function. A large number of pits, here in the slide, a large number of pits dug into the rocky ground contained charcoal, burnt animal bones, pottery, especially drinking vessels, and terracotta figurines. This must have been an open ritual space where participants of offerings and following cultic meals have assembled, afterwards deposited the animal bones and the vessels, and so on. Although we have no trace of an altar or temple, it probably was in the beginning a cult in the open air. The situation changes at the end of the 9th, the beginning of the 8th century BC. The pits came out of use. Instead, a large communal building was erected in the south, with outer walls built with excellent ashlar masonry, a wall that could be followed for at least 8 meters. The excavation is not yet complete. It's now a public building, a ritual center, again with animal bones, charcoals, vases, a building for ritual banquets, and a building, of course, of more ambitious architectural design. Ana Lucia d'Agata has, I think, convincingly proposed that the shift from residential buildings to a ritual space under open air was a first step indicative of a larger community, which needed some cultic ritual installations on the Acropolis. And the next step is the monumentalization, the building of a public character, possibly an indication that now an urban community evolved which erected a new cultic center. But of course, further investigations are necessary. I show you two of the pits which are dug into the rocky surface. These are real large pits of 1.5 meters in diameter. These are no simple rubbish heaps. And the public building to the right. This is the outer wall. The stones in the middle are part of the pavement of a later Roman street. And you find a selection of the pottery of late Manon 3C from the houses, proto-geometric from the pits. In Knossos, the fragmentation of the archaeological evidence is clearly visible. Nevertheless, thanks to Nicholas Coldstream's work, some general lines of the development of the site after it declined during late Manon 3C during the 12th century can be reconstructed. Coldstream has collected finds of the proto-geometric and geometric periods, mainly wells of houses, scattered house walls and stray finds of pottery. During the early Iron Age, an area of at least 500 to 250 meters was inhabited, and recent excavations have shown that it extended to the villa of Dionysus about 200 meters even further to the north. Thus forming a very large, what Coldstream has called urban nucleus. And there was an extension of the settlement area during the late geometric period, during the 8th century BC. Thus, there was continuous building activity, a settlement which probably covered the whole area, not scattered houses, not scattered house groups, which later coalesced into larger structures. This is also indicated by the distribution of cemeteries. Here's the palace, the settlement area, the cemeteries in the north, cemeteries as well in the south, near the borders of the settlement. Cemeteries with extremely rich burial gifts, like the jewelry from Hanya Liteke of the 7th half of the 9th century. And you have some specimens of proto-geometric pottery from the site of the Roman villa of Dionysus far in the north. What eludes us are informations about the structure of Iron Age Knossos. We have no information about public spaces, no information about the street system, about urban sanctuaries, about possible fortification. So next to nothing, you could say. The history of settlement is mirrored in the development of the cemetery areas. During the sub-Manon period, the 11th century BC, a new burial ground was opened north of the old center, the so-called North Cemetery, which continues into the 7th century BC. The foundation of the North Cemetery is possibly to be connected with the arrival of a new population of Dorian Greeks at Knossos around 1100 BC. And this period marks a new step in the development, a new beginning after the decline during late Manon 3C. Especially the early sub-Manon tombs of aristocratic leaders, show a remarkable wealth and thus underline that the 11th century was a turning point in the history of Knossos. The number of tombs increases considerably during the proto-geometric period, a time which corresponds to Coldstream's observations of an early urban settlement there. And Knossos had at the same time an extra urban sanctuary on the coast, Amnisos. In Manon times, the settlement transformed into a sanctuary during the proto-geometric period, and this went hand in hand with the development of the town of Knossos itself, finds increase during the following periods. The main lines of the urban development of Festos, ancient Phaistos, may be defined with some certainty thanks to thorough investigations by Daniela Lefebvre-Navarro. The plan shows the extent of the Hellenistic settlement, which comprised a wide area from the so-called Acropoli Mediana, the former Minoan palace, to the west and to the south, including points like a small settlement at Halara here in the south. The oldest possible Iron Age structure is a fortification wall excavated by Doro Levi in the 1950s on the so-called Acropoli Mediana and dated by him to the proto-geometric period, although the excavation has never been published in detail. Today, the fortification wall is partly overbuilt by storerooms of the Italian mission. This may have been some sort of refuge settlement. Later, during the 7th and 6th centuries, the hill probably became a cult place, as is indicated by an architectural terracotta. Substantial buildings of the 9th to 8th centuries have been discovered in the south and in the west of the palace, in the south down to the plain to Halara here. The slide shows the west and the south side of the palace. Substantial house architecture of the 9th century could be excavated there, and there was a wide paved road 5 meters wide leading down the hill. So fragments, parts of a large settlement, and it was a settlement which had a cult place as well in the south at this point here. The cult place underneath the 7th century so-called Temple of Rhea, which according to Nicholas Kutza is more probably a sanctuary of the goddess Leto. The cult goes back to the late 9th, 8th, early 8th centuries BC as fragments of bronze shields comparable to those from the Idaean cave of Zeus indicate. The monumental temple itself was built during the 7th century, probably mid of 7th century. Just as Knossos, Festos has established peri or extra-urban sanctuaries in its hora. One of them is the so-called Piazzale dei Sacelli above the Minoan and Mycenaean remains at Agia Triada, placed 3 kilometers away, with rich finds of terracottas as bronzes, many of the proto-geometric B period, the same date as the substantial buildings around the former Minoan palace. The 2nd century is Komos, a Minoan harbor of the palace of Festos in the Bronze Age, a sanctuary site in the early Iron Age with first structures of shrines of proto-geometric B date 2nd half of the 9th century. One of the shrines is characterized by 3 uniconic baityloi plus Phoenician pottery. It probably was the cult place of Phoenician seafarers who visited South Crete. I have discussed Komos on Friday afternoon. To conclude, in Festos we may see an early urban structure, residential areas, systematic system of streets, and a central cult place during the 2nd half of the 9th century BC, contemporary with the establishment of larger sanctuary sites at Agia Triada and at Komos. The erection of a monumental temple of Rhea or Leto illustrates a later enlargement, probably not only of the sanctuary, but of the settlement as a whole. As Knossos and Festos, Kydonia, modern Chania, was a Minoan center and was continuously inhabited during the early Iron Age. Despite the overlying medieval and modern structures, Maria Velasaki has been able to define the perimeter of the geometric settlement according to a series of pottery finds starting during the proto-geometric period, increasing in the late geometric period, the 8th century BC, not only with local wares, but with imports from Attica and Argos. At least during the 8th century, Kydonia must have been a substantial center, larger than the later medieval Venetian town, although we know next to nothing about its architecture and structure. Around 700 BC, Kydonia must have experienced a second phase of cultural flourish and economic prosperity. In 1935, a limestone block with the relief of chariots attacking a temple was discovered in the southern part of Chania during building operations. This is the horse of the chariot temple with the cult statue, and this is a reconstruction. The whole block must have been about 2 meters in length originally. 80 centimeters approximately are preserved. And this relief must have adorned a temple building, a new monumental cult center of a flourishing community. It's datable to by its style to about 700 BC, and it's one of the earliest monumental stone sculptures in Greece. I shall comment briefly only on Dreros. Excavations by the École Française d'Athènes are going on, and they have brought some new results. There are no Bronze Age remains. We do not know very much about the 10th and 9th centuries BC. A decisive step in the history of Dreros was the erection of a temple, a hearth temple, during the second half of the 8th century, a temple whose statues have been found in situ, and they are late geometric in style. They are not later, as sometimes has been supposed. The temple is situated in the saddle between the two Acropolis hills. It is, by the way, the oldest first millennium hearth temple in the island, which again was used according to the osteological material discovered there for groups of the population which gathered there for ritual banquets. Spiridon Marinatus, the excavator of the temple, which is, as I said, situated in the saddle between the two hills, believed that the neighboring agora was built at the same time, temple site and agora. That would have been the first central public space in a Cretan city. Unfortunately, the ongoing new French excavations have unearthed nothing that is earlier than the Hellenistic period. Not even pottery, by the way. But inscriptions of the 7th century city laws of Dreros, as I have shown it at the beginning, have been found on the stones of the temple. So the agora cannot have been very far away. Perhaps it was only a place without any monumental architecture at this early period. On the West Acropolis, by the way, at approximately the same time, probably turn of 8th to 7th century, a temple was erected, which sometimes has been interpreted as an Andreion, but it seems to be a temple indeed, which also shows the uprise of the city of Dreros around just before or around 700. Trinias, a town situated on a plateau, 500 meters long, dominating one of the main lines of communication between the Cretan north coast and the south. Late Minoan 3C pottery and a sanctuary with terracottas of goddesses with raised arms resemble those found at Carfi, and they indicate that there was a refuge settlement, although of unknown size. The sanctuary was found in this area here. Pottery of the proto-geometric, geometric periods is abundant and indicates continuous settlement, although the town with more or less rectangular laid out streets, insulae of residential areas, and 3 sanctuaries, temples A, B, and C, seems to be a new building project of the Orientalizing period after 700. I just show a specimen of proto-geometric B pottery, the plans of temples A and C, typical hearth temples again. Temple A, this one here, is of special importance because it was richly decorated with relief sculpture of the Middle Daedalic period around 650 BC. There are two statues of enthroned goddesses on a block decorated with friezes of grazing deer and lions, as well as female figures at the bottom. There's a frieze of young warriors on horses and a naked goddess at the entrance of the temple. The reconstruction has been controversially discussed. To the left, that of the excavator Luigi Pernier. To the right, the more probable one by Immo Bauer. Prignas, by the way, even the ancient name is unknown, was abandoned at the beginning of the 6th century. The territory possibly was integrated into the Hora of Gortys, the most powerful neighbor. A very difficult case is represented by the early history of Gortys in the Mesara, the later Roman capital of Crete. Despite investigations by Giovanni Rizza, Nunzio Allegro, Matteo da Cunto, Francesco Lippolis and others. Important for us are the mountains of Prophetess Elias with traces of late geometric settlement, as well as the hill of Aios Ioannis to the west, which became later the Acropolis of Gortys. And then please look at the plain here. There's a early temple of Apollon Pythios. A vast settlement area on the Prophetess Elias hill has been explored by Nunzio Allegro, mainly of the 8th century date, coming to an end shortly afterwards, but this has not yet been published. On the Aios Ioannis hill, Giovanni Rizza in the 1950s has located a late Minoan III settlement, only some small parts of the houses, which was possibly fortified. Around 800 at latest, this settlement seems to have been abandoned. The hill was transformed into a sanctuary, which is documented by a rich series of terracotta votives. But it is not before the mid of the 7th century BC that a stone temple with relief decoration depicting female naked goddesses and their male parhedros has been erected. A temple which unfortunately was destroyed and overbuilt by a Byzantine basilica of the 6th century BC. Nevertheless, this temple may have had a forerunner. A bit further down the hill, an early Daedalic enthroned goddess of more than life size has been found, time around 680 to 670 BC, possibly a cult statue, which of course would have needed an appropriate monumental architecture. The construction of the temple of around 650 is open to discussion. Rizza has proposed a long hearth temple with the entrance with the relief decoration at the end, at the front walls, and two statues or high reliefs of sphinxes here. Matteo da Cunto has proposed a broad rectangular building with the entrance at one of the long sides. This is also the type of the earliest sanctuary of Apollon Pythios in the plain. The temple otherwise is Hellenistic Roman, but the lowest strata show such a broad temple of the 7th century. Thus we observe an evolution which we have described in other places as well. A late Minoan 3C refuge settlement superseded by the area of a sanctuary around 800, temple buildings of the 7th century. It's difficult to say what the development of the geometric settlement on the Prophetess Elias hill was. Probably the population was transferred down into the plain during the 7th century. As my last paragraph, I shall discuss whether the rise of urban structures during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, which we have observed in several sites like Knossos, there even earlier perhaps, Infestos, Sybrita, corresponds to similar developments in prominent Cretan sanctuaries. The best starting point is the cave of Zeus on Mount Ida, one of the largest Cretan caves, the entrance 25 meters wide, with a stone altar in front. The cave overlooks the Nida high plain and is situated at a height of 1,350 meters, approximately above sea level. Therefore not accessible in winter, and snow is lying in front of the cave sometimes until June or even until beginning of July. Classical tradition, like Platon's Nomoi, connects the sanctuary with Knossos. Epigraphical evidence also shows links with Festos and Gortys in the south. We can characterize the cave as a pan-Cretan sanctuary, the most important one, where the youth of Zeus was located. Legs and handles of tripod cauldrons, typical motifs of Greek aristocracy, are just surpassed in number by the sanctuaries of Olympia and Delphi. And the number of these motifs increases during the 9th century. The largest quantity dates to the 8th. Perhaps even more diagnostic is an astonishing high number of Near Eastern imports. Among them, ivory vessels manufactured in North Syrian workshops of 10th or 9th century date. I compare the fragments from the Idaean cave with finds of Syrian origin from Nimrud. Later ivory plaques, parts of furniture, dates to around 800 or a bit later. It's of the so-called intermediate style, which is style between Syria and Phoenicia. Among the metalware are small Egyptian bronze juglets with reliefs of lotus flowers on the handle. There are more than 15, more than in the whole of Greece otherwise, of these juglets, which are 12 to 15 centimeters high. I show here some Egyptian parallels. It was a popular and long-living type in Egypt and Nubia from the New Empire to about 700 BC. Datable and very well comparable imports in the Toumba cemetery of Lefkandi came to light in tomb contexts around 900 BC, late 10th, early 9th century BC, so approximately the same period. And there's also imported metalware from North Syria. Among the vases, a bowl displaying groups of bulls, which probably originates in Tel Halaf, which is rather far inland here. This is the Idaean cave, Tel Halaf is here. And it is datable by comparison with ivories from the place, as well as stone sculptures, not later than the mid of the 9th century. Imports, of course, continue into the 8th century BC, among them delicately decorated Egyptianizing bronze bowls of Phoenician origin, and another Phoenician type are bowls with friezes of bulls, which were copied in Attic vase paintings of the second half of the 8th century. So an 8th century date is secure. The distribution map of Phoenician bowls in the Mediterranean. Crete, as you can see, was part of a larger network of Phoenician maritime trade at this period. And imports of metalware stimulated local Cretan production of ambitious metalwork, especially votive shields with complex figural scenes. Their production, according to recent parallels in the cemetery of Elephthana, starts at the beginning of the 8th century. The decoration of the shields, just to give a few examples, is a combination of Near Eastern, partly North Syrian types. You have this vulture above the lion, Phoenician styles and iconography as here, as well as Greek elements, for example, the representation of a dipylon shield. So this mixture, this eclectic style, makes local production highly probable. The date of the shields is confirmed by friezes of grazing animals on some of them, a style and an iconography which is mirrored on Attic gold bands found in tombs at Athens, series which cannot have started much later than 750 BC. If we sum up, the motifs illustrate a very early period of cultic activities, of astonishingly rich ex-votos of ivory, bronze, and, by the way, gold as well. This is jewelry from the Idaean Cave and its parallels in Knossos, second half of 9th century. So an astonishingly rich series of ex-votos of ivory, bronze, gold, starting around 900, at latest continuing into the 8th. Allow me to draw some conclusions. Around 1200 BC, some old Minoan cities are abandoned. For example, Malya. Others continue at a reduced scale, for example, Knossos. A new phenomenon of this period are refuge settlements away from the coast in the mountainous areas of Crete. Some of them allow insight in thematic planning of complex arrangements of buildings, the so-called Konglomeratsiedlung, for example in Kaphi and Halasmenos. The second variant are scattered single buildings, like in Kavusi, Vronda. Small temples are the cultic centers of these communities, and during the 12th century at Vronda and Kefala, hearth temples are attested for the first time, places where exclusive groups of the community made their offerings and assembled for common meals. Some of the refuge settlements are confined to the 12th century, Kaphi, Vronda. Some continue as small villages into the geometric period, for example, Halasmenos. Some developed into poleis, Zybrita and Gortys. Second, the immigration of Dorian Greeks around 1100 BC has shaped the evolution of some centers, foremost Knossos. In other sites, there is no visible break or no intensification of architectural activities, of burial grounds, and so on. Note that still the Odyssey describes an island characterized by a rather mixed population. Pelasgians, Eteocretans, Achaeans, and, in the last point, Dorians. Third, in Knossos, Festos, and Zybrita, we may observe an extension of the settlement areas, the establishment of new religious centers during the late proto-geometric and proto-geometric B periods, which means late 10th and 9th centuries BC. Religious centers are in the sites themselves as well as in the Chora. Knossos and Festos, old Minoan sites and centers, are expanding. In Zybrita, which in the beginning may be classified as a newly founded refuge settlements of the 12th century, the Acropolis evolves into a large ritual area, which a first monumental building at the end of the 9th century BC. And this period, generally speaking, 9th century, seems to be a crucial phase. The evolution of what we may call either early urban or proto-urban structures, at least. The more important sites at this time took part, as we have seen, in the cult of Pan-Cretan sanctuaries, as, for example, the Idaean Cave of Zeus documents very well. Fourth, the second half of the 8th and the 7th centuries BC are a period of consolidation and monumentalization, characterized by monumental temple architecture, partly with sculptural decoration. In Dreros during the 8th century, in Kydonia, Chania around 700 BC, in Gortys probably in two phases at the beginning and more clearly the mid of the 7th century, in Festos and Prinias around the mid of the 7th century. This period must have been a phase of economic prosperity, which is not only mirrored in public building activities, but also in another innovation, in the evolution of monumental art, monumental stone sculpture on the island of Crete. Please remember that Crete, beside the Cyclades, was the region which decisively contributed to the origin of Greek bronze and stone sculpture. And in Crete, the beginnings go back into the second half of the 8th century. For example, a stone head, half life-size, must be late geometric from Amnisos. The statues from Dreros, the largest one, 80 centimeters in height, are also late geometric. And then follows, of course, the series of early Daedalic, more than life-size, enthroned goddess from Gortys, Spherelata bronze statuettes of Cretan origin found in Olympia, the larger ones probably 1 meter 50 centimeters height, parts of the face, parts of the coiffure preserved, and of course our rich finds of the middle Daedalic period after 650. I only take the well-known Dame d'Auxerre as an example. Processes of synoikismoi, which means Aristotle's model, the concentration of the population of komai, of villages, in a newly founded center, is not well attested in the archaeological record. Processes of this kind may have taken place at Gortys, whereas Knossos, Festos, Cyprita display continuity of nuclei of Bronze Age settlement into the Iron Age and aggrandizement of these structures at the beginning of the first millennium. Ladies and gentlemen, in the beginning I've characterized our archaeological record as extremely fragmentary. Many observations remain, of course, hypotheses, but I think what I have presented to you today is a resume of our present state of knowledge and its possible interpretations. Thank you very much.
Les difficultés du mouvement chrétien au 2e et 3e siècle.
Il n'y a pas beaucoup de temps d'après le programme.
L'étude que je consacre, de la Respublica Romana.
Exploité au
Première vue, rien à voir avec ce...